And we have to. I want to make sure I understand you. Because the government sets a minimum wage, what does McDonald's do?
McDonald's? It can't hire as many teenagers. It improves its capital equipment to serve. It does less business because it has to charge higher hamburger prices. In the absence of a minimum wage, McDonald's would be able to offer a larger number of jobs to a larger number of youngsters, and they would be able to acquire some skills. And not only McDonald's.
So we hire more people get work. Younger people.
The younger people would work, and they'd get a chance to develop their skills to become productive members of society instead of being driven into a cycle of poverty and of welfare, which is absolutely deplorable.
Milton Freedman, the economist, returns in a moment.
I want to know if you charge a lot for your services. In other words, how much do you get paid?
As much as the market will stand. I believe in a market price, and I tell you something. I think people value what they get at what they pay for it.
And what are you doing with your money?
That is my business and not yours.
Dr. Freeman.
Yes.
I'd like to know your view on the busing situation, especially with the gas situation.
Of course, I'll be glad to tell you my view on the busing situation. The general, very little time, the fundamental idea is that people should be free to choose. That's the title of our TV series, incidentally, is Free to Choose. They should be free to choose whether they want to send their child to this school or that school or any other school. And the way to do it is to introduce a voucher scheme so that people can have freedom to choose. I am not in favor of compulsory busing. I am not in favor of compulsory integration. I am in favor of freedom.
What'd you say about voucher? The voucher what?
I would have a voucher system. You said I had to keep it brief, so I can only mention it. A system under which parents who chose not to send their child to a particular public school would be entitled to a payment like the GI Bill of Rights, a voucher which they could use at any school of their choice.
Yeah, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open a school.
Very good.
And I'm going to hire an advertising agency.
Well, wonderful.
And I'm going to have cheerleaders saying, go to Donahue High, because it's got the best football team. And I'm going to get all these vouchers, and I'm going to have the biggest super school in the whole county.
Wonderful. Marvelous.
I don't know if it's wonderful.
If you can succeed, you cannot succeed by advertising what's not true. Ford Motor Company couldn't sell an Edsel that way, and I don't think even Phil Donahue could sell lousy education that way.
Yes.
You know, people think the public at large are a bunch of stupid people. They're not.
Yeah.
Doctor, is there anything the average citizen can do to protect himself from the ravages of the rising inflation?
Unfortunately, there is very, very little he can do. I hate to say this, and yet it's true. The most effective protection against inflation is high living.
How do you mean that? How do you mean that?
I mean that, unfortunately, there are no assets which you can confidently acquire with the expectation that they will provide you a hedge against inflation. On the other hand, if you buy yourself a nice house, you buy yourself a nice suit, you buy yourself a picture to hang on the wall, you are protected against the ravages of inflation.
So, in other words, convert your money into material things?
Unfortunately, it's not a very desirable thing to do. Don't convert all of it. You've got to have some reserve for emergency. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm saying that inflation is the kind of thing which leaves you with no good choices.
But that sounds like playing the violin while Rome is burning.
Well, tell me the alternative. The question was not what the nation ought to do.
Yeah.
I have no difficulty in saying what our governmental policy ought to be to end inflation. That's a different question. The question is, what can I as an individual do? And unfortunately, given the uncertainty of inflation, given the fact that real estate has proved a good hedge and it's proved a bad hedge, that stocks have proved a good hedge and they've proved a bad hedge, that government bonds are a snare and a delusion, that they have proved a very, very poor investment for the poor suckers who were induced by Uncle Sam to come into them. Unfortunately, there is no good way in which the ordinary citizen, the ordinary person, can really protect his assets against inflation.
Dr. Friedman, I wanted to point out that a lot of people will agree that medical care costs are terribly expensive these days. And some hospitals that I know of, particularly in the South, have cost containment programs that are voluntary. Are these feasible? And if they are, why don't other businesses start them?
Well, in the first place, every business has a cost containment program. There is no business in this country that doesn't unless it's on the verge of bankruptcy. In the second place, in all of these questions, one shouldn't look at the symptoms. One ought to go back and ask what the sources are. The reason why medical costs have been rising so rapidly in the country is, again, I sing the same old tune, but it happens to be true. Because whereas some 15 or 20 years ago, government spending on medical care accounted for something like 10, 20% of the total amount spent on medical care. That was mostly in public health and for veterans. Today, it amounts to something like 40% or more of the total spending, and that's what's been driving these prices up.
Milton Freedman returns in a moment. You'd be against mandatory wearing of helmets for motorcyclists, too.
Of course. I think people ought to be free to do what they want.
What's wrong with... why can't the government be paternalistic and maternalistic and care for its citizens?
Well, that depends on what kind of government you want. Of course it can be, but it turns out that the paternalism tends to serve the interests of the people who are being paternal and not the people whom they are supposedly protecting.
And it's expensive.
I am not... don't misunderstand me. I'm not against all government measures. I'm not an anarchist. I believe we need a government for certain basic functions. We need a government to protect this country from foreign enemies. We need a government to protect me from being bashed over the head by you. And because you can find some valid function of government doesn't mean that everything government does is valid. And the problem today is not that we have too little government, but much too much government.
Milton Freedman can be seen on PBS next year in several one-hour shows. Many thanks to this Nobel Prize winner for bringing his enthusiasm to our show, and thank you for your participation. Have a nice day, everybody.